Hello guys, I am Muhammad Umar Khattab and welcome to Let's Learn with Umar. I hope you're all doing well and today's video is going to be about moon landings. So let's get right into the video. Moon landings. Moon, also called lunar after the twin sister of the Roman sun god. Diameter 2,159 miles. Temperature minus 287 to 253 Fahrenheit. The moon is about 240,000 miles. There is no air, wind, nor liquid water. There is a layer of dust over everything. There is no atmosphere on the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon, officially titled the Address at Rice University on the nation's space effort, is a September 12, 1962 speech by United States President John F. Kennedy to further inform the public about his plan to land a man on the moon before 1970. Kennedy gave the speech, largely written by presidential advisor and speechwriter Ted Sorensen, to a large crowd at Rice University Stadium in Houston, Texas. He said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because the challenge is one that we are willing to accept and one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too." From Earth to the moon. Landing people on the moon was a much harder job than just getting a person into space. A trip to the moon and back would take at least a week. When President John F. Kennedy made his promise, no one had been in space longer than a few hours. There were other problems as well. In 1961, there were no good close-up pictures of the moon's surface. From Earth to the moon. Astronauts would need moon maps to help them find a good landing spot. Also, no one had ever spent time in space outside a spacecraft. Astronauts on the moon would need special suits to protect them from the moon's very hot and cold temperatures. American scientists and engineers worked very hard to solve all these problems. From Earth to the moon. In 1961, they began sending probes to the moon. In 1964, one of the probes took very clear pictures of the moon's surface. This picture helped scientists find a safe place for the astronauts to land. On June 3, 1965, Irwin became the first American to walk in space. He spent 21 minutes outside a spacecraft as it orbited Earth. He wore a space suit that let him breathe and protected him from the cold. From Earth to the Moon. X-White said that going back inside the spacecraft after walking in space was the saddest moment of his life. A few months later, astronauts Gordon Cooper and Charles Pitt Conrad orbited Earth for 8 days. They proved that people could stay in space long enough to the moon and back. From Earth to the Moon. Then on Christmas Eve 1968, astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders orbited the moon 10 times. They wished everyone on Earth Merry Christmas from outer space. They proved that people could travel all the way to the moon and return safely to Earth. Finally, the Americans felt they were ready to put a person on the moon. The moon. On July 16, 1969, a rocket blasted off from Cape Kennedy, Florida. The rocket carried a spacecraft called Apollo 1. There were dangers every step of the way. Anything that went wrong could ruin the whole mission. A tiny mistake could mean death for all 3 astronauts. On July 20, 1969, 4 days after the launch, Apollo 11 went into the orbit around the moon. A few hours later, the LM landed on the moon's surface at 9:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first person to set foot on the moon. Edwin Buzz Aldrin followed a few minutes later. Neil Armstrong had thought very carefully about what his first words from the moon should be. When he stepped onto the moon's surface, this is what he said. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Important people. Neil Armstrong. Neil Alden Armstrong was an American astronaut and aeronautical engineer, and the first person to walk on the moon. He was also a naval aviator, test pilot, and university professor. Armstrong was born and raised in Wapakoneta, Ohio. Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin is an American former astronaut, engineer, and fighter pilot. Aldrin made 3 spacewalks as pilot of the 1966 Gemini 12 mission and as lunar module Eagle pilot on the 1969 Apollo 11 mission. He and mission commander Neil Armstrong were the first 2 people to land on the moon. Aldrin is the last surviving crew member of Apollo 11. Charles Pitt Conrad Jr. was an American NASA astronaut, aeronautical engineer, naval officer, and aviator and test pilot, and that commanded the Apollo 12 space mission, on which he became the 3rd person to walk on the moon. Conrad was selected in NASA's second astronaut class in 1962. Alan Bean. Alan Levern Bean was an American naval officer and aviator, aeronautical engineer, test pilot, and NASA astronaut. He was the fourth person to walk on the moon. Alan Bartlett Shepard Jr. was an American astronaut, naval aviator, test pilot, and businessman. In 1961, he became the second person and the first American to travel into space. And in 1971, he walked on the moon. Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Dean Mitchell was a United States Navy officer and aviator, test pilot, aeronautical engineer, ufologist, and NASA astronaut. As the lunar module pilot of Apollo 14, he spent 9 hours working on the lunar surface in Fra-Mauro Highlands Rim, making him the 6th person to walk on the moon. David Brendolf Scott is an American retired test pilot and NASA astronaut who was the 7th person to walk on the moon. The commander of Apollo 15, Scott, was selected as an astronaut as part of the third group in 1963. Scott flew to the space 3 times and is one of the 4 surviving moonwalkers and the last surviving crew member of Apollo 15. James Irwin. James Benson Irwin was an American astronaut, aeronautical engineer, test pilot, and a United States Air Force pilot. He served as Apollo lunar module pilot for Apollo 15, the 4th human lunar landing. He was the 8th person to walk on the moon and the first and the youngest of those astronauts to die. John Young. John Watts Young was an American astronaut, naval officer, and aviator, test pilot, and aeronautical engineer. He became the 9th person to walk on the moon as commander of Apollo 16 mission in 1972. He flew on 4 different classes of spacecraft: Gemini, the Apollo Command and Service Module, the Apollo Lunar Module, and the Space Shuttle. Charles Duke. Charles Moss Duke Jr. is an American former astronaut, United States Air Force officer, and test pilot. As lunar module pilot of Apollo 16 in 1972, he became the 10th and youngest person to walk on the moon at age 36 years and 201 days. Eugene Cernan. Eugene Henry Cernan was an American astronaut, naval aviator, electrical engineer, aeronautical engineer, and fighter pilot. During the Apollo 17 mission, Cernan became the 11th man to walk on the moon. As he re-entered the Apollo lunar module after Harrison Schmidt on their 3rd and final lunar excursion, he is the last man to walk on the moon as of 2021. Harrison Schmidt. Harrison Hagen Jack Schmidt is an American geologist, retired NASA astronaut, university professor, former U.S. Senator from New Mexico, and the most recent person living to have walked on the moon. In December 1972, as one of the crew on board Apollo 17, Schmidt became the first member of NASA's first scientist astronaut to fly in space. Getting to the moon was very dangerous and very expensive. So why did the US decide to send people there? At the time, America's big rivals were a group of countries headed by Russia called the USSR. American President John F. Kennedy decided being the first country to get a man on the moon would make the USA look more powerful than the USSR. And scientists and engineers working on the Apollo missions produced lots of advances in computers, communications, mechanics, and engineering that affect and help us today. Artemis. The Artemis Program is a United States-led international human spaceflight program. Its primary goal is to return humans to the moon, specifically the lunar South Pole, by 2025. If successful, it will include the first crewed lunar landing mission since Apollo 17 in 1972, the last lunar flight of the Apollo program.